Hi, everybody. Well, thank you. Thanks. How many of you have been on a vault tour either with me or with NOLA? A few? Okay. If you have been on a vault tour with either one of us, you've probably seen a first edition of the Star-Spangled Banner. And this is one of, we're not sure exactly how many copies there are. I've always said fewer than 10. We have a book called Handbook of Early American Sheet Music. This is a reprint of a book from the 50s, and in this book they say that there are 8 copies. But because it was done in the 50s, and I'm not sure when we came by the copy that we have in the vault downstairs, but since the foundation was founded in 1956, I doubt that that is among the 8 that they mention. I'll also say that I've had a conversation with Dr. David Hildebrand, who is a professor of music at the Peabody Institute and also with Colonial Music Institute. He said in an email to me a couple years ago that there are 6 copies. So we're not really sure how many copies, but there aren't many, and we've got one. Now, in the process of cataloging our collections, I've found as many as 4 so far settings of the tune which would become our national anthem. And so I thought it would be interesting to take a look at those copies and also kind of the history of the tune and how it got to be our national anthem. When I was cataloging the Pater Codex, first of all, I got to say that this was examined in a lot of detail by one of our predecessors, Janine Ingram, back in the late 70s. She wrote a couple articles in the Moravian Music Foundation bulletin, and in those articles she listed the tunes that were in the Pater Codex, and but it wasn't until I started doing the in-depth cataloging for Gemeincat that we started putting some pieces together. One of the tunes in the Pater Codex is something called Atoms and Liberty. And if you look at the tune, you see the tune that looks like the national anthem. But he didn't have any words in the Codex. There are other things that he refers to in this. You see something following the title that he refers to a folio book. There could be a long, or he mentions also a long quarto. These were some other manuscripts that we don't have anymore, don't know where they are, that he refers to where something is in a fuller format. There were also something called zettels, which are little scraps of paper where he would have lyrics to some of the songs, but he doesn't have room to fit the lyrics in the song here. Now, we don't know exactly why the Pater Codex is here in Winston-Salem. Now, I say that because the earliest date that we can precisely date in this thing is from about 1800. It's missing the first 98 pages. So it starts with page 99 and goes through 270 some. But because it starts with something that can be dated around 1800, I'm not sure why it's here. Now, I say that because we know that Johann Friedrich Pater, who copied this, worked and lived here from 1780 to 1790. And after that, he was up in Maryland for a short time, and then in Bethlehem, had a short time in Hope in New Jersey, but never came back down here. So I don't know why it's in the Winston-Salem vault instead of the Bethlehem vault, but there it is. Now, Janine Ingram, in one of her articles about the Pater Codex, says, Pater's apparent purpose in the preparation of his book was to copy music which might later either be requested by others in the community or be used in music classes at some local school. Additionally, one must assume that this small book indicates, to some extent, Pater's own preferences, since some sort of value judgment must be made by him before he included a composition. In his commonplace book, or the Pater Codex, When one considers that Pater was one of the most knowledgeable musicians among the Moravians in America, the value of his commonplace book to present-day researchers increases substantially. Here, truly, is a key to Moravian musical tastes. As such, it beckons the inquisitive, inviting exploration of its contents. Now, when I saw this, I thought, I wonder what the words were, because we don't have the Zettel or the folio book that he refers to. And so I did a search of the Lester Levy sheet music collection at Johns Hopkins University. And I did, in fact, find a piece of sheet music that referred to Adams and Liberty. Go to the next screen, if you would. But then I noticed at the top, King and Country. That doesn't sound like something around Adams and Liberty. It is actually a parody of Adams and Liberty on the other side of the pond. And so if you look at the texts, and we'll compare the text between the two. It's a rather lame parody of Adams and Liberty. So I was really curious now. Well, I found an English parody of Adams and Liberty, but I didn't find Adams and Liberty. So looked a little bit more. And we do have Adams and Liberty in the Lidditz manuscript book collection. And so thanks to my colleague Jan Harkey, we got an image of that. Turn the loose, and there it is. And looky there, it's got lots of words. But I also found a copy of Adams and Liberty at the Library of Congress. And if you go ahead and go to the next screen. And there's the text of the first part. Ye sons of Columbia, who bravely have fought for those rights which unstained from your sires had descended. May you long taste the blessings your valor has brought, and your sons reap the soil which their fathers defended. Mid the reign of mild peace, may your nation increase with the glory of Rome and the wisdom of Greece. And ne'er shall the sons of Columbia be slaves, while the earth bears a plant or the sea rolls its waves. Now, while you see this, I'm going to read you the English parody, and you'll see how lame it was. Ye sons of Britannia, who bravely have fought for those rights which unstained from your sires have defended, may you long taste the blessings your valor has brought, and your sons reap the soil which your father defended. Mid the reign of mild peace, may your nation increase with the glory and valor and wisdom of Greece. And ne'er should the sons of Britannia be slaves, whilst the earth rears a man or the sea rolls and laves. They didn't bother doing a whole lot to that, did they? So the Anacreontic song, what is it? Where did it come from? And we will, the body responsible for this song was London's Anacreontic Society. It was a musical club and a venue for male sociability, and a club that functioned from about 1766 to 1792. To Anacreon in Heaven was used as the club's song from the early 1770s. The poem was written around 1773 by Rafe Tomlinson. It looks like Ralph, but he goes by the name Rafe, kind of like Rafe Vaughan Williams. Then the Anacreontic Society president, and the song's melody was composed by society member John Stafford Smith, and we'll talk about him in a moment. Writer, historian, musicologist William Lichtenwanger notes, Tomlinson's playful lyrics are a good-natured takeoff on a bit of pseudo-classical mythology. And we'll turn next to some of the lyrics, and you'll see that. To Anacreon in heaven, where he sat in full glee, a few sons of harmony sent a petition that he their inspirer and patron would be when this answer arrived from the jolly old Grecian. Voice, fiddle, and flute, no longer be mute. I'll lend you my name and inspire you to boot. And besides, I'll instruct you, like me, to entwine the myrtle of Venus and Bacchus's vine. Now, one of the myths about this song was our national anthem came from a drinking song. We'll see in a moment. So the composer, John Stafford Smith, he was a composer and organist. He was the son of an organist at Gloucester Cathedral. He was sent to London to study with William Boyce. In 1761, he became a chorister at the Chapel Royal, and by 1785, he'd become lay vicar at Westminster Abbey. Now, as a composer, he's known for his catches and glees, but also for some of his church music. However, now he's known not only as a composer of the Anacreontic song, but for some of his pioneering work as a musical antiquary. He's regarded as, quote, virtually the first English musicologist. He placed his collection of old music manuscripts and editions at the disposal of Sir John Hawkins, who acknowledged him in the preface of his General History of the Science and Practice of Music. And by the way, the foundation holds a copy of that multi-volume set downstairs in the vault. Smith also owned a copy of Burney's History of Music, which he wrote in the marginal notes a lot of nasty comments that Burney was stealing Hawkins' thunder and critiquing Burney's shallow scholarship. Now, we also have a set of Burney's History of Music downstairs in the vault. And it's interesting to Moravians because we know members of the Latrobe family translated stuff from German for Burney in the process of his writing of the General History of Music. Next screen. And this is a picture for the Anacreontic Society. Next. And a meeting ticket for the society. Tickets from the 1770s bear an image of a young man and a young woman adorning the bust of Anacreon with a garland of flowers representing Venus and Bacchus, you'll remember from the text, in connection with the lyric poet. The design was engraved by Francesco Bartolozzi. He was a renowned London-based artist with close association to other several musical figures in the London area. Now, it's possible that some women were admitted to society concerts, since tickets were both issued in red ink, arguably for the women, and black ink for the men, as early as 1781. An example of a 1781 red ink ticket by Bartolozzi is held in the British Museum. And writer McVeigh notes that in 1787 season, that season saw a permanent change, with ladies hosted for a portion of the meetings, as was reviewed and critiqued in the contemporary press. And this was mentioned in an article, and I love the title of this, Trial by Dining Club. The anecdote told by William Thomas Park, for example, describes the disruptive presence of Georgiana Cavendish, the Duchess of Devonshire, during a club concert and subsequent entertainments, with the result that the society was, by an act of gallantry, brought to premature dissolution. The Duchess of Devonshire, having heard the Anacreontic highly extolled, expressed a particular wish to some of its members to be permitted to be privately present to hear the concert, etc. Some of the comic songs, however, not being exactly calculated for the entertainment of ladies, the singers were restrained, which, displeasing many of the members, they resigned one after the other, and a general meeting being called, the society was dissolved. Now, there's another interesting link with the Duchess of Devonshire in the Pater Codex. One of the songs in the Pater Codex is something called the New African Song, based on words from Park's Travels, but it's versified by the Duchess of Devonshire. And if you look at her name, Georgiana Spencer Cavendish, Duchess of Devonshire, yes, she's an ancestor of Lady Diana. Oh, really? Yeah. So there have been some outspoken women who have been causing trouble for a long time.
I wonder if they had to sit separately when they went.
They did.
For tickets.
They had to sit in a balcony behind a lattice so that they were not seen. They could hear the concert, and usually they were dismissed after and not allowed back for, how they ran this was that they had a concert that ran from about 7:30 to about 9:30 or so. And then the men went from the concert hall at the gathering place where this was. It was a large venue for a good concert hall. And actually, I skipped part of it that we know from the contemporary press that Joseph Haydn, on one of his visits to London, actually attended a meeting because they performed some of his works at one of the concerts that took place in one of their meetings. So the men, after the concert, and the ladies were allowed to listen from behind the lattice up on the balcony, they went, had their dinner, and then they came back and they started singing their catches and glees, and the drinking started, and by the end of the meeting, they were singing their society anthem. So whereas it was not a drinking song, it was a song sung after a lot of drinking. So. So, New African Song, that's the record in Gemeincat. The next screen shows you a copy of that New African Song out of the Pater Codex. And now we turn back to the Star Spangled Banner and talk about Francis Scott Key. Francis Scott Key was a lawyer, author, and amateur poet. As a lawyer, he worked on important cases such as the Aaron Burr conspiracy trial. He also argued cases several times before the U.S. Supreme Court. He would later be nominated by President Andrew Jackson to serve as district attorney for the District of Columbia. He was a devout Episcopalian and extremely active in his church. In fact, as a young man, he was torn as to whether he would enter the ministry or become a lawyer. Key was a pacifist, a man willing only to take up arms when his home was threatened in the British advance on Washington, D.C. And we see some of his faith reflected in some of the text. Then conquer we must when our cause is just, and let this be our motto, in God is our trust. Unfortunately, he also owned enslaved persons. During his lifetime, abolitionists ridiculed his text of the Star Spangled Banner, saying that America was, quote, land of the free and home of the oppressed. As a DA, he suppressed abolitionists. He was also a leader in the American Colonization Society, which sent freed slaves to Africa. The Star Spangled Banner was not his first poem set to the music of the Anacreontic song. Next. When the Warrior Returns, using the same melody he wrote, was penned in honor of a recent victory of U.S. Navy officer Stephen Decatur over North African pirates. Key is said to have once sung this at a dinner for Decatur in Washington. You can see the lyrics foreshadowing the Star Spangled Banner. The third verse has the line, by the light of the star-spangled flag of our nation, and the song ends, where mixed with the olive the laurel shall wave, and form a bright wreath for the brows of the brave. This text was published in 1805 by the Boston Independent Chronicle. So Mark Clegg, a person who does a lot of research about the Star Spangled Banner, and he's a professor of music at the University of Michigan. I can't say the name of the state because it's just north of Ohio, and I'm from Ohio, and we're not allowed to say the name of the state. He says Francis Scott Key was held, the myth number one was Francis Scott Key was held prisoner aboard a British ship during the bombardment of Baltimore. And his correction on that is Key was aboard his own American truce ship during the battle. Key and a fellow lawyer, John Skinner, a U.S. agent for prisoners of war, sailed from Baltimore on September 5th, 1814, on an American truce ship and headed down the Patapsco River, hoping to meet the British fleet somewhere in Chesapeake Bay. They were on a mercy of mission to negotiate the release of the elderly Dr. William Beanes, a civilian non-combatant who had been taken prisoner by the British as they departed Washington, D.C. after the Battle of the White House, the Capitol, and other government buildings in revenge for the U.S. burning of York, current-day Toronto, in April of 1813. Key was a persuasive addition to the negotiating team because of his close family ties to both the United States and England. His father served in the Continental Army, but his uncle remained a British loyalist during the Revolution. Key's mission was a success. During the talks, however, then upon the release of the doctor, Key and Beanes were moved to the HMS Tonnant, where they had negotiated with British Admiral Cochrane, to the HMS Surprise, and finally back to their own British truce ship. The exact name of the ship has defied generations of researchers. During the harrowing 25-hour bombardment, their ship was tethered to a British vessel, one not involved in the fighting, and placed under guard in order to prevent Key and his companions from revealing to Baltimore's defenders any attack plans overheard. So that clears up a little bit of some of the myths you may have heard about the writing of this. Yet Key rose on the morning of September 14th, 1814, and through the lens of his spyglass saw his nation's 15-star, 15-stripe flag waving defiantly over the fort. He was elated and relieved, certain that God had intervened. He spent the next 2 days waiting for the British to depart, when they would release him and his compatriots. And so he wrote, screen please, there's the oldest surviving manuscript in Key's hand of the Star-Spangled Banner, and it was soon published as the defense of Fort Henry. It did not have a C in there, I'm not sure why, it was not McHenry, but that's how it was published soon after that. And then, as we know, the music publisher Carr, got a hold of it and wanted to get to be the first publisher to have that thing out, and that's why it's as a periodic song and not a patriotic song, because he was in such a hurry to get that thing out there, he didn't do enough proofreading. It's an article by Richard S. Hill, who was a librarian at the Library of Congress in the music division, and he wrote an article about the melody of the Star-Spangled Banner in the United States before 1820. In this article, he has a list of about 84 different parodies that were published in the United States from the 1790s to 1820. And this is a graph showing how many appeared in different years, but a total of 84. This article was done in the 50s. Since the writing, more parodies have come to light. So far as the songsters are concerned, is his quote, that aftermath reached a natural stopping point in 1820, since the financial depression that followed the War of 1812 abruptly reduced the supply of new publications. So there were more after 1820, but he stopped at that point because of the lack of publications due to the Depression. As musicologists know, there's a long history in Europe of contrafactum, which refers to the recycling of a piece of music. Many times it takes a secular piece of music, adds a sacred text. Martin Luther was well known for doing that. The process is also known as parody, that is, composing of new lyrics for a pre-existing tune. Johann Sebastian Bach did parodies of his own works, using movements, for example, of his Brandenburg concertos or his orchestral suites in his church cantatas. This practice we see over and over again in the music of the Moravian Church. We have a setting of Mozart's Ave Verum Corpus, which has a translated Moravian text, and that's one of our Moravian Star publications that's available. And coming just out of Christmas time, Schultz's Thou Child Divine is also a piece of contrafactum or a parody. It's actually from an opera. Furthermore, in Hill's classification of parodies, he gives a classification of these parodies, naming American patriotic parodies, different types, general patriotic subjects, 4th of July parodies, those that honor George Washington or other presidents, parodies sung at dinners for military heroes, etc. American non-patriotic parodies, and those that were English in origin. And I'm not going to do an exhaustive list, but I'm going to share with you a few. Next screen. This is the earliest known occurrence of the text used with the tune of the Anacreontic Society in America. It has much in common with the original Anacreontic song, with its allusions to mythological beings, as we saw in the original. This is by Francis Hopkinson around 1790. This unfold, Father Time, thy long records unfold. Richard Hill of this same article states, with minor alterations, the poem was adapted to the melody of To Anacreon in Heaven, and in this form was published as the first and only sheet music edition of this melody issued in the United States before the publication of Adams and Liberty, which we saw earlier. Next. For the commemoration of the glorious 14th of July, referring, of course, to the French Revolution. This is the first known published American lyric to the Anacreontic melody, and the first known to be written by a woman. Next. Oh, and those are subsequent verses of the same. On azure-wove couches, as the gods lay reclined, this comes out of the Edinburgh Musical Miscellany in Edinburgh, 1792, and then was subsequently published here in America. It's interesting because of the text you see at the bottom. Father Jove then looked down from his crystalline throne, which the star-spangled luster celestial shone. It's interesting that the term star-spangled shows up. Now, I don't have an image for the sheet music of this, but if you Google azure wove couches, what you get are ads for Wayfair and Lazy Boy. Next screen. More free than the mohawk that glides through our plains. This patriotic song is by William Ray. It uses the tune Anacreon in Heaven. And at the end of 6 stanzas says, Amsterdam, New York, July 4th, 1807. You read through that, but of course, as with the lyrics of the Star-Spangled Banner, you start questioning, man was born to live free. Who are they talking about? Next screen. Ye chiefs of the Wabash. This refers to a lot of battles that took place in Ohio, Indiana, and other parts of what was then the Northwest Territory around the year of the War of 1812. Some of the early skirmishes with the Native Americans did not go well for the U.S. troops, and that's reflected in the text. This was published sometime after 1814, the fighting between the U.S. forces and Native American tribes in Ohio and Indiana after some major defeats. What's fascinating about this sheet music is that it includes not only this text by Joseph Hutton, but also the text of Francis Scott Key's Star-Spangled Banner on other pages, and the text of the Anacreontic song in a single publication. Next screen. This comes from The Balance, a Columbian repository. It's a political satire aimed at Jefferson and his embargo of 1806. The Embargo Act of 1807 was an attempt by Thomas Jefferson and the U.S. Congress to prohibit American ships from trading in foreign ports. It was also intended to punish Britain and France for interfering with American trade while those two major European powers were at war with each other. Jefferson had hoped that it would prevent a war between the U.S. and Britain. It didn't, and it made the trade deficit soar. It really did not work out well for Thomas Jefferson at the end of his presidency. Now, some of the effects of the War of 1812 had some major impacts for the United States. It was the first conflict where the U.S. Congress actually issued a formal declare of war. It was a moment in world history where the U.S. achieved more international respect and recognition as an actual functioning country that could hold its own. Remember, we were just around for a few decades at this point. It also represented the start of the antebellum period, the era before the Civil War. This was a time in which the North and South became so entrenched in opposing views that reconciliation was no longer possible. This was also a time when massive plantations flourished and slavery truly became a way to define Southern life. Setting all this up was the War of 1812. Now, in the Revolutionary War, there were blacks that fought along with whites, and in some of the northern states, that earned blacks their freedom. That did not happen in the southern states. The British took advantage of this, and in the War of 1812, at first, the United States did not allow blacks to fight. But as the situation got more serious, they decided they would let black men join the Navy. Most of the fighting, of course, was naval warfare. And on ships, they could not segregate, as they would have wanted to do, the blacks from the whites. Ships were too small. They were eating together, they were sleeping together, they were working together, they were fighting together. And one writer says that there were as many as 15% of our fighting forces in the Navy at that time were blacks. Now, the British were trying to take advantage of the situation in the South and were offering freedom to blacks who fought for Britain. We also know that there were some blacks who fought for the British that actually were among those that marched up to Washington and burned Washington. But Britain was very cagey. They did not want to start any slave revolts in the Western Hemisphere because they still owned colonies in the Caribbean, and they didn't want word getting out that there were slave rebellions in the United States when they still were controlling slave population colonies in Great Britain, in the Caribbean. So that kind of gives you the context for Frederick Douglass's address in 1852 in Rochester, New York, in what has become a very famous speech, The Meaning of the Fourth for the Negro. He gave this talk to the newly formed Rochester Ladies Anti-Slavery Society. It was an abolitionist and society in upstate New York. And abolitionist and former slave Frederick Douglass used the words from the U.S. Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, and the Bible to address the concepts of liberty, citizenship, and freedom that did not include the enslaved population. He could have easily used words from the Star-Spangled Banner saying, "Or the land of the free." Really? Who are we talking about? That doesn't apply to me or my people. Now, folks in the South considered the Star-Spangled Banner their song. Its author was from a state south of the Mason-Dixon line, and he himself was a slaveholder. With the outbreak of the American Civil War, musicians from 3 Confederate bands came from Moravian settlements in North Carolina, serving the 21st Regiment, North Carolina Infantry. And this is coming from our own finding aid of the Salem Band Collection, which contains music of the 26th Regiment Band. And as you can see, this is the 4th occurrence of the tune in the collections that we hold. All 3 bands that were involved from this area were captured in the final battles leading up to the Confederate surrender at Appomattox. The music of the 26th North Carolina Regimental Band has survived nearly intact. Fragments of music of the other two bands with Moravian members have also survived. So in the South, they were considering Star Spangled Banner was their song. While in the North, next screen, we have what was written by Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr. That's not the Oliver Wendell Holmes that was a lawyer that later became a justice in the Supreme Court. This was his father, who was a physician and an essayist and a poet in the Boston area, I believe. He wrote what he proposed to be a fifth verse of the Star Spangled Banner, which took up the issues in which he looked forward to emancipation. From Stephen Moocher, education professor at Bard College, he stated that Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr. wrote the fifth verse, I believe, with real sorrow at what was happening to his country. The divisions that we had in this country in 1861 are similar to what we have now, he says. Of course, it was actual war then. This verse, which circulated throughout the North, contained hope for the future. By the millions unchained who our birthright have gained, we will keep her bright blazon forever unstained. And by the millions unchained, he is, of course, looking ahead to the emancipation of enslaved people. Moocher says, in closing, he can't quite imagine a country without "Oh Say Can You See," but he'd like for people to sing both the first and the fifth stanzas as a way to unite around the principles of the Constitution, both in pride and protest. Finally, I want to show you a screen grab from PBS History Detectives, and I want to give a shout out to Music Foundation trustee Ben Wallace, who told me about this after one of the vault tours in which he saw the first edition of the Star Spangled Banner that we saw earlier. And there's a website, you can check that out. It's a very interesting story. This manuscript was found in the house of a woman in Oregon, and she took it first to Antiques Roadshow. You know, how much is this worth? And she got it, but it wasn't enough. She wanted to know more about the historical context of why is this document important. And so what you see there at the beginning of each one of these is the melody of the Star Spangled Banner, but it's preceded by initials for Walter Damrosch, who was the conductor of the New York Symphony Orchestra, which would later be known as the New York Philharmonic. Educator William Earhart, Oscar Sonic, who was librarian, editor, musicologist, and in the early decades of the 20th century, he was the head of the music division of the Library of Congress. There was the Society for American Music was created in his honor and had been named for him, the Sonic Society. John Philip Sousa was also on this committee, as was Arnold J. Gantfort, a musician, an educator, a member of the Congressional Committee for Revision of the Star Spangled Banner. He taught at the College of Music in Cincinnati and later at UCLA. He chaired the National Education Association Committee for Revision of National Songs. And so the woman that had taken this to the Antiques Roadshow got a number of scholars to take a look at that. Among them was the man I mentioned earlier who talked about how many copies of the first edition there are, David Hildebrand. He was one of the people who was interviewed in that. And it's interesting as you look through this, they compared how all these different scholars thought the Star Spangled Banner should go, and they agreed except for one place. Take a guess where that was in the song.
Land of the free.
Exactly. Is it da bum 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 bum? Is there a fermata there or not? And they didn't agree there. So later, And so we don't, and I don't remember when exactly this was, early 20th century. Of course, John Philip Sousa had made this very popular. It was not officially our national anthem, but because of his work with military bands for decades, and he played it over 1,000 times with military bands, it was already kind of recognized as the national anthem. But it wasn't until 1931 that President Herbert Hoover signed the official declaration saying that this is the national anthem. So in closing, I'd like again to thank Ben Wallace for letting me know about this PBS History Detectives video. Also Andrew Manning of the Duke University, Donna Rothrock of Salem College, Rupert Ridgewell of the British Library, and Jan Harkey of the Foundation Office in Bethlehem. Thank you.